wanted to do a refresher about the time-weighted case mix. Um, this is actually the PowerPoint that I put together back in the day when we were transitioning from the old model to the new model, to time-weighted, which we currently have right now. And this PowerPoint probably still makes reference to the old way. I'm obviously not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because now I think most managers now have been with time weighted long enough that this is what they're used to. Have an agenda. So obviously we're going to talk about what the time weighted means, the differences between, I am going to touch on the differences between the time weighted and what we were doing before, because I think that that's helpful from an educational standpoint. We're going to look at the report, what the therapy managers need to be focused on in case mix meetings. And if we have time, we'll go through a couple of examples. So I want to start with this. This is the case mix tree that I've shown you. So we'll start over to the left. We're talking about the broader rug levels, at least until October 1st of 2025. This is the case mix tree, and these are the rugs over here in these left diamonds that we're going to be dealing with for reimbursement. Broadly, the higher up on this tree the rug level is, the more the reimbursement. It doesn't always work out that way. But so when we're going from the left column, which is the rugs, over to the next, the second column with the diamonds, a lot of times the rugs are affected by ADL. Well, they're always affected by ADLs. And if you keep moving over to the right, they can be affected by other things such as restorative nursing, whether or not they are triggering for depression on the PHQ-2 or the PHQ-9 and other clinical indicators up in extensive services. So that's going to put all of those together, are going to put, this is every Medicaid resident in your building, Medicaid or Medicaid pending. It's going to put them all into a rug level, and the rug values are what is over on the far right column. So a PA1 is, what is that, 0.57, all the way up to an SE3 is 2.08. So that's why I said, generally speaking, over on the left, the higher the rug level is, typically that's a higher paying rug, but there are some examples like an RAA is higher than an SSC, but an SSC's reimbursement is higher. So this over here on the right is pretty much gospel. So this is the case mix methodology we had before the current one. So we had this quarter, in this case, it was January, February, and March. And let's say that MDS did an assessment on January 1st, and this resident scored a PA1, which is the lowest of the rugs. So that's the rug that resident was going to be assigned with, unless if that was still the rug, if they were in the facility on the last day of the quarter, and unless there was another assessment that was done to increase the rug. So in this case, that is what happened. On March 27th, we did an assessment and captured an RAB. So whatever this residence, even though this PA1 was done on January 1st, this RAB that was done on March 27th wipes it out. So this resident would have been an RAB on that case mix tree report that I was just showing you. Whereas now, this is the current, the time weighted, which we have to deal with now. Exact same situation. A resident has an ARD in which they achieve a PA1 on January 1st. They are a PA1 for all of these green days in January and February and March. We've done, so they were put on therapy. We were able to capture a rehab assessment on March 27th. They're only a rehab rug for those 5 days. So whereas this resident would have been under the old system, rehab rug the entire quarter. Now, again, the exact same ARDs, exact same process. They're on the therapy caseload, the exact same number of days, same startups of care dates and everything. They're only an RAB for 5 days. So this scenario, the buildings were really, really hurt compared to the previous methodology. Whereas if the opposite were true, we'll go over some examples. If they were a high rug early in the quarter and then they scored a low rug later on in the quarter, the facility would have made out better. So that's really the biggest difference between the way we used to do case mix and the way we do case mix now. So it started on October 1st of 2021. So we haven't been dealing with it for all that long. We've only been dealing with the actual reimbursement off of it since April 1st of 2022. As with, I'll keep mentioning changes that are going to be happening on October 1st of 2025. At this point, as of, what is today, April 7th, we don't know a whole lot of details because as far as I know, I haven't heard where North Carolina has decided what they're going to do yet, but you know that they're going to go to some kind of PDPM reimbursement. And because of time weighted, that and they've got to make a change on October 1st, but we cannot wait until October 1st to start thinking about that. The assessments, because of this time weighted, some of the assessments, some of the days that are going to affect the October quarter are actually going to be done in the July through September quarter, just like it was when we initially transitioned to time weighted. So expect to hear a lot more about that as we know more from the state, if we know more from the state, but we really have to start optimizing case mix in advance of October 1st. Some other examples of the point in time case mix, which is what we used to be on versus time weighted. Now, all assessments matter, not just the last ARD, which is what I was showing you before, whereas somebody would have had a PA1 early in the quarter, and then they had a rehab ARD later in the quarter. Now both of those count as opposed to just the last one that was done. The total patient case mix is based on the average of all CMIs and days during that quarter, as opposed to just the last assessment. All Medicaid and Medicaid residents that were in the facility during that quarter will be used to determine the case mix. Previously, under point in time, only the residents who were in the facility on the last day of that quarter, so on March 31st, on June 30th, were going to be counted. You could have had a resident that had this great, super high paying rug, maybe an extensive services from January 1st through March 28th. They get discharged under point in time. They did not count towards case mix, but now they do. So the report is a lot longer because it counts people even that were in the facility for a day. The facility will want low paying rugs to count for the fewest number of days possible by completing another assessment as soon as a higher rug could be attained. And we'll go through that in a lot of detail because that's what a lot of what you're going to have to discuss in your case mix meetings. And then some things did not change from point in time to time weighted. MDS still has to do an OBRA assessment every 92 days. So that's going to become a factor when we're planning assessments. We'll talk about that. You can still complete as many assessments as necessary to capture residents' needs, even if you got an MDS coordinator that is telling you that they can't or it's illegal or anything like that. They're called significant change assessments. You can do an assessment every single day if you want to capture whatever is going on with that resident. They don't have to just be done quarterly. Requires thorough interdisciplinary collaboration, and that is something that I'm especially, as we're looking at transitioning on October 1st to something, I'm starting to hear more from administrators and corporate people and MDS supervisors and things like that, that they A, want the meeting to be happening, and B, they want the meeting to be more than just MDS and therapy. They want it to be nursing and social work and dietary, and everybody's in there to complete a total clinical picture of this resident. All total resident CMIs will be averaged to determine a total CMI. That has not changed. And then the RUG CMI values, which is the first slide that I showed you, all remain the same. So when we were initially going to transition, I said earlier that the new CMI report is a lot longer and a lot more detailed than what the previous report is. It includes, obviously, the resident name, their ID, their record type. So was this a quarterly OBRA? Was it an admission, significant change, discharge, et cetera, et cetera? What those ARDs were, what rug they attained off of that ARD, the start date of that rug, the end date of that rug, how many or the number of days of that rug, what the CMI figure, and then the payment source. So whenever you get that report, this is blacked out over here on the left column. These are the resident names and their ID numbers. But it'll also have when, as opposed to just the last ARD that was done in the quarter, is going to have every ARD, every rug level attained that was done on that resident in that quarter, and it's going to give an actual breakdown of what that means for that resident. So we get these reports, as you guys know, four times a year. The facility is going to get a preliminary report first from the state. And when they get that preliminary report, they don't need to just send it to me and be done with it. They need to go through. The reason they're getting a preliminary report is because they make mistakes. We've had facilities that have found significant errors on these that they were able to correct and send back to the state before they got their final report. So a resident is on the report and they're not supposed to be. A resident is not on the report and they are supposed to be. There's a missing ARD. The rug is different. The number of days is off. The payer source is different. The MDS and the billers need to be looking at all that. And, therapy managers can have a part in that. But, certainly, I thought that we captured Miss Jones in June and they're not on this report. I mean, if we see something like that, we need to be a partner. But MDS and billing is going to be what is going through. They really need to be weeding through this report to find errors before, and then send those errors back to the state. I'm always suspicious when I have a facility that their preliminary numbers are always the exact same as their final reports. Are they actually going through and making corrections? So again, that's what the preliminary report is for. We're trying to catch errors. All residents in the facility during that quarter should be listed on the report now. So if anybody is missing, that's an error that needs to be corrected on the preliminary report. But also correct payers, correct ARDs, correct number of days, correct rugs. I thought this person was going to be an RAB, and on the report they're a CB1. That's something that needs to be corrected. So what are the implications for us? A lot of, especially we only deal with, unless you're a building that has that we are responsible for the restorative, which is almost none of the Trinity buildings except for Scotia. We only really have a lot to do with one of those rugs, right? Rehab. And the reason that there's such an emphasis on rehab is because, as you saw on the first slide, that's the highest paying rug next to, if they're able to capture ventilators or parenteral feeding or isolation or something like that. Usually it's going to be rehab that is going to be the highest, the gold ring of rugs in your Medicaid building. So this is a resident that, okay, they had been on therapy in December and we're able to capture a rehab rug on January 1st. Remember, you do not have to do that unless this resident is going to qualify for an RAC, an RAD, or an extensive service rug, then the MDS coordinator is not going to want to do another assessment on this person unless they qualify for a higher rug than this RAB sometime before March 31st. We do not need to touch this. This is somebody that we can just file away. We don't have to talk about this person again until April. So again, we do not have to do another rug in the quarter because one is not required, because there's 90 days in the quarter and they only have to do an assessment every 92 days. Versus, so here's 2 quarters we're looking at here. So it's always important to know what the last rug was and how long we've been sort of trucking along with this same rug. This is a similar scenario. SSB is a special care. That's a pretty high paying rug. It's pretty good. So unless we do something otherwise, we got an ARD of January 1st where an SSB was attained. That MDS coordinator does not have to do anything until sometime in April, whatever 92 days is from January 1st. But around, I'll say March 22nd or 23rd, this resident was put on therapy caseload. And they had enough days and minutes of therapy that an RAC could be attained on March 28th. Yes, MDS absolutely does want to do that assessment because the rehab rug on the case mix value for an RAC, and so therefore the daily reimbursement is higher than that of an SSB. Maybe a little bit of a talk that we would have to have with MDS because this is her doing an assessment a few days before what she thought that she was going to have to do, and we're going to have to be moving this assessment. And this is one of the things that we're talking about in the case mix meeting, is that, hey, the ARD isn't until April 2nd, but we can capture that increased reimbursement on March 28th. So let's just go ahead and do that assessment. Most MDS coordinators are going to want to do that. So that RAC is going to hold this person all the way, so the remaining days of March, all the way through April, May, most of June, until we have to do something. June 28th is probably 92 days from March 28th. So if for whatever reason we could recapture this SSB, or they're back on therapy, or we can capture a higher rug, we absolutely would want to do that assessment to capture. But if we're going from an RAC, which is a great case mix value, to a PD1, which is not a great case mix value, we want to put off that assessment as long as possible. We do not want a single more of these red days coming back into this yellow. So one of the biggest selling points for your MDS coordinators are going to be doing, so that was moved, the previous slide was moving an assessment, and it wasn't moving it, all that was moving it a few days. So usually that's not a hard sell for them. But remember, we're not the only ones that are factoring into the assessment. A lot of other disciplines, and nursing has to have supporting documentation for things, social work. So if we're expecting MDS to move an assessment, there has to be a lot of collaboration. Everybody needs to know about that. Anybody who has anything to do with that ARD and that rug, they need to know that ARD has been moved up or back so they can do their part also. So what if we've got a resident, again, I told you we can do as many assessments as we want to, but you have to do an assessment every 92 days. This is a resident who was on OT caseload from 3/25 through 4/8, and we could attain a rehab rug on April 1st. So that's what we did. That's, again, unless there is a higher rug, a higher rehab rug or an extensive services, then they're probably not going to want to do anything with that until potentially they don't have to until early July. So just because the resident was discharged off of OT, we're not going to do another assessment to down code that rug. This is not a Med A PDPM IPA. That's not the way case mix works. So we're not going to do anything until now, because of a fall or whatever. The resident was on PT caseload 6/22 through 7/10. So let's say that this is somebody who, without therapy, they're going to go down to a CA1. So MDS has got to do an assessment July 1st, July 2nd, but they would want to do a rehab, even though this is a completely optional assessment. This is something that they do not have to do. They want to do another assessment on June 26th to capture this PT. Reason being is because that assessment is going to reset that 92-day clock. If you do not do this RAB on June 26th, and then we come down to July, the next week, and do this assessment on July 1st for a CA1, it's going to make all those days that could have been an RAB off of June 26th ARD, it's going to turn them into CA1s. So we do not want to do that. The facility is not going to want to do that. Your MDS coordinator may not want to do this assessment, but I assure you that that is going to work out better for her, and the facility from a reimbursement standpoint. Sometimes, so that was 2 different therapy episodes. What about these residents who were on caseload for a long time? And sometimes this may seem like it's making insignificant changes, but you do this on enough people and they go from rehab to a very low rug, it could make a big difference. So this is a resident who was on whatever therapy 5 times a week from 10/4 through 10/29. So we can do an assessment to capture, that they're on caseload to begin with on 10/6. So that's great. That's going to put them into a rehab rug. But remember, this is somebody who was on caseload until 10/29. That's, 1, 2, 3, over 3 weeks difference. So if we don't do anything else, MDS is going to have to do another assessment 92 days from this 6. If they were to do another assessment, again, optional, but if they were to do another assessment on October 29th, the day that the resident discharges off of therapy, to reset that 92-day clock, it's going to give them more days at that rehab rug. And ever since we went to time weighted, that's the name of the game. You want as many days in those higher rugs as possible. You want to, if it's going to be an assessment that is going to down code that rug at all, you want to offset that as long as possible, up to 92 days. So what is the therapy rug? Because we still get confusion about this. The therapy rug is attained by 5 visits of therapy and 150 minutes. It is not calendar days of therapy for case mix. Again, this is not, you got to take your PDPM Med A hat off, because that is 5 calendar days, any combination of disciplines. But for Medicaid right now, up until October 1st at least, is 5 visits of therapy. So you could attain therapy rug if all 5 disciplines are in and you get enough minutes. You can get a therapy rug on day 2, because you had PT, OT, and speech on Monday and PT and speech on Tuesday. If you got 150 minutes, that's a rehab rug in 2 days. You do not have to have 5. Calculation today they're counted from the entry date if the resident enters during the quarter, or from the first day of the quarter. So if they were, they were admitted to the facility on, let's say, March 1st, then their day count, their ARD count, their rug count for the April through July count, the ARD is going to be back in March. But we do not have to do another assessment in in April to capture that. Days covered by leave of absence are included in the count of days because they do not require a discharge assessment. That includes temporary home visits, temporary therapeutic leave, hospital observations that are less than 24 hours when the resident is not admitted. That's pretty high level MDS stuff that I wouldn't worry too much about. A great way of capturing rehab for these residents who are frequent flyers, or they're long-term residents that, so they're a long-term resident of your facility, they go to the hospital and they come back Med A. Most of the time, 99.9% of the time, Med A is going to entail therapy, where a rehab rug, the 5 visits and 150 minutes was attained. So if the Med A resident stays in the facility and transitions to Medicaid, a new assessment is not required for 92 days from the PPS assessments. The resident's Medicaid days will still be paid based on the overall facility case mix, but their assessments will not factor into the CMI coverage. So this is somebody who stays, they transition from Med A to Medicaid or Medicaid pending. They don't necessarily have to have another assessment, especially if that's going to drop them into a lower rug than that rehab rug. So it may not behoove the facility to do a Medicaid assessment unless that resident's new rug would be an increase to the overall facility case mix. And again, this person's already in rehab. That's going to be pretty hard to trump. If a Medicaid assessment is done for a low rug, it will bring down the facility's overall CMI. So there's no reason to do that. I mean, this is one of the few cases that we can be telling MDS coordinators that if they are doing that extra assessment to drop the rug on that resident, that is something they do not need to be doing. Consider over-assessment while the resident is still on Med A. It can't be the admission assessment or combined with a PPS assessment, or on the first Medicaid day to capture therapy on a high nursing rug. So they're going to either discharge off of therapy with Med A, but we could still capture an ARD for rehab if that's going to be beneficial, or for whatever reason they would qualify for one of the higher rugs. MDS can do another assessment to capture that, but I think that's pretty rare that happens. So we harp a lot about case mix meetings, and first of all, we want them to be done every week. But what does that need to look like? What do we need to talk about? So first of all, I don't have a slide for this, but you need to be getting calendars from MDS. They're doing them every month. You should still, this is the next to the last week of April. I would expect that we would be getting a May calendar, if not before. So make sure that we are still getting those calendars and we are thinking along the lines of that 321 form. I would prefer that the 321 form is actually done because I'm just a very visual, organized OCD type person. But the purpose of that 321 form is exactly what I was talking about earlier. We need to see that ARD coming. What are the needs of that resident, and what are we going to have in place before that ARD in order to capture the rug? Not just therapy, but all of the other departments in the whole facility. So we need to be talking about when this resident is now 2 or 3 weeks out from their ARD. What is the current rug on this person? If it's their rehab or their extensive services, you're probably not going to have as detailed of a conversation because those rugs are already pretty high. But this is a PA1, a PB1, something that's really, really low that's going to pull down the facility's overall case mix. You're going to want to have a very detailed conversation about those people. What were their ADLs? What are their ADLs now? We need to be bringing out that quality measures report and looking if they're flagging on anything, especially if it's going to be affecting the facility's 5-star rating. What was the previous rug? When is the next ARD required versus when could we do one to, okay, this is somebody who is in a low rug right now, but I think that they have therapy needs. They don't have to have another ARD, another ARD for another month, but we can go ahead and capture therapy now to offset those low rugs that the person already has. Does the resident require or are they scheduled for services, treatments, diagnoses that would improve a rug? Are they hemiplegic? Are they on COVID isolation? Are they getting therapy, et cetera, et cetera? And how soon can we capture those services if it increases the rug or the CMI? Again, that's where you really have to know that the requirements of each rug. Again, it's for a rehab, it's not 5 calendar days, it's only 5 actual visits. Residents in a lower rug level should be discussed weekly to ensure a higher rug cannot be attained. Because again, we just did this assessment 3 weeks ago. This person is PA1, but for whatever reason, because of orders and visits, therapy, a diagnosis, COVID, something that happened at the hospital, et cetera, we can go ahead and capture that rug. You don't want to wait until they're back on the MDS calendar to realize that. We need to be talking about those lower rug people every single week to make sure we're not missing something that could affect the overall case mix. All residents, again, must be discussed at least every 92 days. So the MDS calendar is still very, very necessary. So a couple of any questions before I keep moving along with examples? So that's a lot of stuff, but I want to give a few examples. So this is me. I'm a resident of this facility. And this is similar to an example that I used earlier. So we've got a January 1st ARD where we captured a PA1, or I came in, maybe the assessment happened in November, December, that was a PA1. Regardless, on January 1st, I'm coming into this quarter with a PA1. On January 27th, because of orders and visits or whatever happened, we can do an assessment to upgrade, maybe not necessary, but we could do an assessment to capture a CB1. CB1 is still not a great rug, but it beats a PA1, so absolutely we should do that assessment. Otherwise, unless you tell, MDS differently, now this is January 27th, we would not have to do another assessment for 92 days, which is going to be sometime at the end of April. So we're going to truck along with this CB1 until March 20th. This person's on therapy caseload, and we could capture an RAB on March 20th. Again, don't have to, but that's a really high rug. So, and it definitely beats the crap out of CB1. So the MDS absolutely wants to do that RAB on March 20th, even though it's optional. So now the PA1 is established from January 1st to the 26th for 26 days. The CB1 is established for 52 days. The rehab rug is established for 11 versus if MDS did not do, so if this was the ARD on January 1st for the PA1, this resident would have been a PA1 for all 90 of these days, which would have been terrible, as opposed to wiping out this CB1 and the rehab rug. So that's just an explanation of all of that. I'm going to implement a few more quarters now so we can get a more long-term picture of me. I'm a resident. So here I've got this PD1 was established on March 25th. Terrible, low pain rug. So that's going to truck along until April the 10th. I'm put on therapy caseload and we can capture an RAB as early as April 13th. So again, they do not have, this is only a few days at PD1, but so they do not have to do, MDS does not have to do another assessment for 92 days, but because the rehab rug is so much higher, they absolutely want to do this optional assessment on April 13th. So I'm trucking along on therapy. I'm discharged. They do not have to do another assessment until 92 days from April 13th. But they would, because I was now on caseload for, what is this, 3 or 4 weeks, they're going to want to do another assessment on May 10th to reestablish, to reset that 92-day clock. Because as you can see down here in August, I'm going back to a PD2. That's a really low paying rug. So we want to extend that time frame as long as possible. If we do not do this assessment on May 10th, then this person is going to be a PD2 starting like July 13th, because that's 92 days. So if they do this optional assessment on May 10th, that's just going to give you several more days at this RAB, which would have otherwise been a PD2. I think I have an actual illustration of this. So if this is the resident that had an established rug of RAA on April 1st, either that was the ARD or they came in with that from the March assessment, an SSA could be established on 5/1, and a PC2 can be established on 6/1. Things to think about in your meetings: which ARDs, you see these ARDs coming, which ARDs should be set. What would this quarter look like? And when would the next required assessment be when we reschedule that? So an RAA, here's an example of an SSA is actually lower on that tree when from the first slide. It's actually lower on the tree, but it's a higher case mix category than rehab. So rehab is not always the be all end all, especially if it's somebody with very low ADL scores. So this is a resident who I'm coming in on 4/1 with an RAA. I can establish an SSA on 5/1. That's going to increase the rug. You absolutely want to do that. Oops. You absolutely want to do that because an SSA is higher than an RAA. A PC2 could be established on 6/1, but look at that case mix index. That is super low. I do not know why anybody, because remember, if we do this 5/1, that's going to put out the next assessment for 92 days. This 6/1 is only a month away. So there's no reason, even though we have seen MDS coordinators to do it, there's no reason to do this 6/1 to capture this PC2. You want this SSA to ride as long as possible, because that's a pretty good case mix value. So this is just an illustration of all that I just said, that RAA is higher on the case mix tree, but SSA is a higher CMI value. So you definitely want to have that. I'm having to whip out that case mix tree all the time. I carry a couple in my bag. If anybody needs a copy of it, let me know and I'll email you a copy. But I would take that to your case mix meetings and know that. I mean, you're not going to memorize it, but you want it for a reference. All right, so questions about any of that? I think that's my last slide. Couple other reminders, just because, we may have new managers or people. So remember the way, it probably should have been my first slide. The way case mix in North Carolina works is that it's an average. So there's 5 of us and we're all Medicare, Med A residents under PDPM. I have my HIPs. The next person has their HIPS codes, the next person has their HIPS codes, and each one of us, the facility is reimbursed something different for what, based on our care, based off of our GGs and based off of our speech grouper and yada, yada, yada. So that's the way Medicare works. The way Medicaid works is that it's an average. So I've got a rehab rug, and then all the rest of you have PA1s. If we can put another one of you on rehab, that's going to increase the reimbursement for all of us, not just even the 3 PA1s that were never on caseload. So, that's why it's really, really, really important that, we make even what may seem like insubstantial changes. We're going to capture just one more week at a rehab rug. We're just going to increase, because of ADL scores, we're going to go from an RAB to an RAC. First of all, that change may be pretty significant in the case mix world, but based on, you times that by the number of days, you do that for a few residents. And so now you do it for 5 residents, that's another increase. And then whatever that change in your daily case mix counts for every single resident in that facility for all 90 or 92 days or however long is in that quarter. So it's really, really important, even if it is what seems to be an insignificant change, and it's probably may be viewed to be more work, especially for MDS, and honestly, it is more work for them. But facilities that have super high case mix values, that is the way it works. So make sure you're having your weekly meeting. Make sure you're having a good clinical conversation about these people, not just what rug that they were and what rug that you think that they're going to have. Is it once you start, especially on these low rug people, you're having a clinical conversation about these people, and you know what a PB1 looks like. The person that you are describing is not a PB1. I think that this person, well, I know that they're hemiplegic, so they should be a special care. What are we going to have to do to capture that special care? That's going to make a huge difference in that facility's case mix reimbursement. And, especially as we're getting closer to October 1st, hopefully is going to make a impact on their quality measures too. For North Carolina Medicaid, it would specifically be your long-term quality measures, which even in high star buildings, a lot of times those are very, very low. So we're going to start having more conversations about quality measures and the long-term quality measures and star rankings and all that sort of stuff. But a lot of it is going to sound very, very familiar because it's going to be the same stuff that we've been talking about for the past 40 minutes, because after October 1st, it may not be affecting your reimbursement, but it could be affecting that facility's quality measures. So that's why after October 1st, we're probably going to have these people on therapy as opposed to attaining rehab rugs. All right. Any questions about any of that? If not, that's all I've got. If you do have questions, as always, feel free to email me or text me or call me or catch me whenever I'm in the building. And I appreciate everybody's time.
Thank you.